All right. So, hi, everybody, and thank you all for joining us for our first graduate student speaker event um, of the semester. And my name is Kara Flynn. I'm the Research and Educational Services Archivist in Special Collections. And the Special Collections Graduate Student Speaker Series was initiated in 2018 by our Associate Dean, Lori Burrell, and I've been facilitating it for the past few semesters, including in these COVID times when we have been virtual. Um, the series is presented in partnership with the Graduate School and International Education, and its goal is to provide graduate students who have conducted research in special collections with a forum in which to present their research and an opportunity to gain experience in public speaking. We welcome students from all disciplines, and I will put some info in the chat towards the end of the presentation if you happen to be a graduate student who's interested in doing research in special collections and perhaps presenting for this series. So today we will be hearing from Michael Anthony, a doctoral student in the history department, and he discovered that not much had been written about an instance of racial violence, commonly referred to as the Catcher Race Riot in 1923, which happened in Crawford County, Arkansas. So he decided to look into it himself. And in 2020, he was awarded a $1,000 grant for his research from the Arkansas Humanities Center as part of the Confronting the Past, Interrogating the Present project. So we will be hearing from him today. It's a really interesting presentation and I've gotten a sneak peek. So again, thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I want to go over a couple of logistical things related to how we will be using Zoom today. All of you have been muted, which you might have noticed. And we do ask that participants stay muted throughout the presentation. We have a chat, which we'll be using for the Q&A session. So we should have about 15 minutes towards the end today for that Q&A. So if you have questions for Michael as you listen to his presentation today, feel free to drop those in the chat and then I can pose those to him at the end. We are also asking that all participants keep their videos off just to avoid any kind of distractions during the presentation. And if you accidentally turn your video on, I will turn it off for you. All right, so it'll take me just a second to pull up the presentation, but we will get started here shortly, and just give me a second to mute myself, turn my video off, and get this presentation shared.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for coming to my presentation today entitled Otherwise You Will Have to Suffer the Consequences, the Catcher Race Riot of 1923. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Anthony. I'm a third-year PhD student here in the Department of History at the University of Arkansas. I really enjoy studying and researching Arkansas history, but this is the first project I've ever undertaken that focuses specifically on race. Last semester, I was enrolled in a research seminar under Dr. Sean Austin, where the goal of the class was to have a manuscript for a journal by the end of the semester. The topic of the seminar was the history of race. While that's kind of a large topic, since I focus on Arkansas history already, my first thought was to try to add to the large amount of research already done on the Elaine massacre in the southeast part of the state. When I was doing some preliminary reading on Elaine, though, and the history of extrajudicial justice in the state, I found an interesting article by Dr. Guy Lancaster that referred to the Catcher Race Riot in 1923 that occurred in Crawford County here in northwest Arkansas. Since I've never heard of that event though. I've taken several classes on Arkansas history here at the university, and no one had ever mentioned that particular riot to me. So my interest was kind of piqued at this point. How have I never heard about this riot, and what could I learn about it and maybe add to the existing field? So, like any great scholar, I typed in Catcher Race Riot into the Wikipedia search field, expecting it to pop up with lots of scholarly articles and discussion on the riot in Arkansas. As you can see, though, nothing came up. It says the page does not exist. Finally, after doing some even more digging and going on Google, I found a 2009 article for the Encyclopedia of Arkansas written by historian Wanda Gray, in which she laid out a very concise summary of what had occurred in the small town. And her findings were very remarkable. Before we get into exactly what happened, though, in this small town, I think it helps to start by first looking at some maps to understand exactly where Crawford County is in Arkansas and where Catcher is located inside that county's lines. So if, like me, you've never heard of Catcher, Arkansas, don't feel bad. It isn't on any maps since about 1930. Here's a modern map of Arkansas divided into its 5 physiographic regions. Right here is Washington County, which is where the University of Arkansas is and where I'm located right now. And right under us, we have Crawford County. You'll notice that Crawford is one of those counties that's divided into the dense Ozark Forest into the north and the Arkansas River Valley to the south. In this blown up image of the county, you can see the dividing line is basically the interstate. Still, though, there's no Catcher on this map. So I went down to special collections trying to find where Catcher actually is located, because I heard it was in Crawford County, but I couldn't find out exactly where it was. I found this 1898 map, which actually shows, for the first time that I could find, the all black towns of Catcher and Shibley. And for those of you who know your Arkansas geography, you'll see Van Buren here, Fort Smith here, and Alma right here. And right in that triangle, in this fertile cotton producing land, you finally have these all black towns. But my initial questions after learning this about where it was is, why is it not on any maps today? What happened to the black population that existed there? And what role did that race riot in 1923 have on these consequences? To answer those questions, though, we need to return to Crawford County on the morning of December 28, 1923. Just after breakfast, around 8 a.m., Effie Latimer, pictured here, a 25-year-old white woman, was found fatally wounded after being shot back with heavy birdshot rounds from a shotgun. Latimer allegedly regained consciousness for just long enough to name her killer, stating, "Son Bettis shot me." William Son Bettis, a local black farmer, denied the accusation, claiming he was picking cotton at the time, but was nevertheless taken into custody alongside 31-year-old Charles Spurgeon Ruck and 14-year-old John Henry Clay, who unfortunately I haven't been able to find a picture of yet, but I'm still looking. Over the next 48 hours, the small town of Catcher in Crawford County divided along racial lines over this crime. Local white community members seeking swift justice attempted to lynch the 3 accused men, but were unable to locate them before they were moved to Little Rock to keep them safe. Frustrated by the lack of public lynching, notices were put up threatening all black citizens to leave the county or be met with swift violence. Posted on the doors of the black community's post office, general store, and log cabin schoolhouse, the notices informed the black community members, "It becomes necessary for the safety of the community to ask you to leave it. You will be given a few days to straighten out your affairs. If you are out of Crawford County in 5 days, you will not be bothered. Otherwise, you will have to suffer the consequences," which is the title of this presentation. Refusing to yield to such demands, 11 black men armed themselves and holed up inside the black community's log cabin schoolhouse. Governor Thomas McRae authorized the National Guard branch in neighboring Franklin County to mobilize and put down any potential insurrection. Only after a white posse of citizens and deputized guardsmen surrounded the barn and pointed a state-of-the-art machine gun at the front door did the 11 men finally surrender. When the race riot finally ended in Catcher on Monday, December 31st, 1 black man was dead, 14 black men were in jail, the local black community had been burned to the ground, the black cemetery there had been desecrated, with tombstones smashed, and around 50 black families had fled the county with nothing but the clothes on their back. Despite these horrifying and disturbing outcomes, largely all that remains in Catcher today is the single street that runs through where Catcher used to be, that's named Catcher Road. Historians have likewise largely overlooked this racial incident when discussing the history of race in the state. As mentioned earlier, Wanda Gray in 2009 was the first to truly establish the facts and hours of the days after Effie Latimer's murder in her Encyclopedia of Arkansas entry. The problem, though, is that Gray did not attempt to place the incident inside the larger context of race in Arkansas or the South in the 1920s. Guy Lancaster, an expert on racial violence in the state, helped fill this void with several articles and chapters that use Gray's research as an example of racial cleansing in the Arkansas River Valley. While skillfully contextualized for these purposes, his work has added relatively little to the existing knowledge on the actual incident itself. Since Gray's initial investigation nearly a decade ago, shockingly little academic research has been done to better understand and examine this critical chapter in Arkansas's racial history. Instead, some of the best and most recent work on the race riot has actually been done by the descendants of those involved and local journalists. Jacqueline Froelich, for example, at Ozarks at Large, has run several stories about the riot and interviewed some of the remaining living descendants. Likewise, Linda Griffith, the great grandniece of Effie Latimer, who is responsible for providing me with most of these pictures, has collected a lot of the sources I use today, and she's trying to detail Effie Latimer's life, and she's hoping to release a biography later this year, hopefully. By exploring avenues made newly available by the digitization of newspapers and the archiving of additional news sources, I hope to use today to help give this presentation to examine exactly what occurred in Catcher, Arkansas between 1923 and the summer of 1924. Going beyond just that, though, this investigation hopes to reveal how this small town reflects much larger trends occurring inside Arkansas and the rest of the Jim Crow South during the same period. Catcher provides an excellent case study to understand how white community members were able to drive out undesired blacks through a combination of intimidation, extrajudicial justice, and legal means. In this one race riot, there was a threatening sign telling blacks to leave, outright violence and a murder after some chose not to do so, two Southern quick trials resulting in immediate death penalty verdicts, a life sentence for a 14-year-old, and an ironic night riding accusation against the 11 black men who had armed themselves. All of this helped accomplish the goal of overall cleansing the community of black members while also allowing white members to take lucrative land from black citizens who had legally held it for decades. What occurred in Catcher, Arkansas in late 1923 then was only made possible because of an implicit understanding between local white citizens and their government that there would be little repercussion for forcing out black members of the community through any means necessary. The same process occurred throughout the state and the rest of the South as sundown and gray towns were commonly established from 1890 to 1940. James Lowen, an expert on sundown towns, argues that more than half of all towns in the Ozarks went all white on purpose. The problem with Lowen's work, though, is that he's kind of a sociologist and that he does not try to adequately explain why some Ozark communities went sundown and others did not. Kimberly Harper helped kind of fill that void by explaining that communities dependent on cheap labor could hardly afford to completely drive out these crucial workers. For this reason, towns that required a significant black labor force, such as Elaine in the southeast part of the state, could be exceedingly racist, but never attempt a full racial cleansing of the community. Only by understanding the unique landscape of an area like Catcher can we begin to then understand why this town chose to forcefully expel the entire minority population rather than lynch the few who had allegedly committed the crime. So this makes perfect sense, Harper's argument, at first, but it doesn't really explain what occurred in Catcher. Going back to the maps of the region, we see that Catcher is located in this really fertile river bottomland of the Arkansas River Valley, making it excellent for cotton production. Black labor was heavily utilized in this town under sharecropping. So why did Catcher undergo a racial cleansing? By examining in detail how the events in Catcher, to properly understand what happened in Catcher in 1923, it is important to first examine how African Americans came to settle in the region. So located on the southern tip of the Ozarks and the northern part of the Arkansas River Valley, the township created this fairly lucrative cotton producing river bottomland like we've talked about. For this reason, Catcher attracted several slave owners who used forced black labor to work the land during the antebellum period. The earliest accounts of the settlement show that the town was inhabited by a larger percentage of African Americans than whites. After the Civil War, a majority of these newly freed African Americans stayed on the land, working as sharecroppers. Relatively few decided to move north or west, looking to capitalize on newly won freedoms. At the same time, these recently freed men began working as sharecroppers, a surge of outside black migration to the state was rapidly occurring. Historian Story McEnroe has found that between the end of the Civil War and World War I, Arkansas attracted more African American migrants than any other state, well over 200,000. Cheap land, relatively high wages, non-farm labor jobs, and the fact that Arkansas was perceived as more racially tolerant encouraged a large number of African Americans to flood into the state during this period. While a majority of these black migrants settled in the southeastern part of the state, A significant number from South Carolina, Texas, and Louisiana moved into this newly created community in Catcher. The town, established just 4 miles southeast of the nearly all-white city of Van Buren, was an attractive place to settle for blacks, as it allowed work on the nearby St. Louis, Iron Mountain, and Southern Railroads, as well as extremely fertile cotton planting land for sharecroppers. So from 1890 to the end of World War I, it appears that the black community in Catcher was able to quietly prosper. The return of veterans, though, black and white, from the war in Europe led to a stark rise in racial and labor unrest in 1918 and 1919. The so-called Red Summer of 1919 saw countless strikes and race riots as communities across the nation attempted to reshape American life after the war. Arkansas was in no way immune to these problems. In perhaps the bloodiest racial conflict in American history, somewhere between 50 and 200 black men in the town of Elaine were killed in a dispute over the payment of cotton crops inside Phillips County in late September 1919. With good reason, the Elaine massacre has dominated the majority of scholarly attention for those studying race in Arkansas. The problem, though, with concentrating on these large singular events, like what occurred in Elaine in 1919 or in the later Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, is that it leads readers to believe these incidents were largely anomalous. So I really like this quote from Guy Lancaster. It is imperative Elaine not be taken out of its proper context, that is presented not singular, not as unique, not as an atrocity without equal in the legacy of white supremacy in the United States, but rather as representing a continuum of history. So while it's true that events like Elaine and Tulsa saw the largest displays of racial violence, the underlying racism associated with these conflicts occurred in different ways throughout Arkansas and the Jim Crow South. Only by understanding the racial history of the region as one long process can we begin to place these single events like Elaine, Tulsa, and Catcher into this larger narrative of race that is still having effects into the present. The brewing racial tension occurring across the state ignited in Catcher when, on the morning of December 28, 1923, Effie Latimer was shot in the back at close range by heavy birdshot round. Here's the Fayetteville Daily Democrat account of the murder. Later that afternoon, Latimer was found bloody, barely clinging to life on her kitchen floor by neighbor Florence Johnson, who promptly called for first responders. Johnson recalled that Latimer's arms and midsections were badly bruised, and she had several slashes across her head and torso. Dr. B.L. Bennett of nearby Kibler rushed to the scene to administer medical aid. The doctor noted that Latimer's head showed signs of severe blunt force trauma, likely from the butt of a gun used for her murder, and that several of the woman's fingernails were torn from their roots, seemingly in self-defense from a sexual assault. Dr. Bennett claimed that Miss Latimer came in and out of consciousness while he was administering aid, and that she gave a description of the man who had shot her. Allegedly, Latimer uttered "son better shot me" to Johnson and Bennett. This accusation would become a key piece of evidence alongside the coerced confession of a 14-year-old in the case against William Bettis for murder. Linda Griffith, the great-grandniece of Effie Latimer, who we've talked about, has recently come up with an interesting theory, though, that perhaps Effie was simply disoriented after being hit with the butt of a rifle and losing so much blood, and was only questioning, "somebody shot me?" So those two phrases, "somebody shot me" and "son Bettis shot me," are pretty close, and perhaps that's why the confusion occurred. All of this, though, seems to just take for granted the lucidity of a woman coming in and out of consciousness after being clubbed on the back of the head and shot at close range. Either way, Dr. Bennett's efforts proved unable to save Latimer, who was pronounced dead shortly before 6 p.m. that night. So here's a picture of the Catcher School, and this is Effie Latimer right here. This looks like kids probably around 12. This is one of the pictures that Linda provided for me, and I just think it's really interesting. It kind of helps to show that Effie was a pretty normal child. A lot has come out since her death that perhaps she was mentally disabled, and that's something that her great-grandniece is now trying to dispute, showing some of these pictures like this one and this one that show her with glasses and part of the just normal everyday schooling, which kind of dispute that notion. So Effie married Robert Latimer, pictured down here, in 1918, when she was only 19 years old. The couple lived a seemingly peaceful life in the town for the 6 years of their marriage. All of this seems relatively normal until you take into account that Robert Latimer, age 38, was mysteriously absent from the couple's home on the week of the murder. Newspaper accounts from Van Buren reported that Robert Latimer had left the family home a week before the murder, taking a dozen chickens and half of the provisions in the house. It seems evident that something occurred in the days leading up to Christmas 1923 that sent Robert out of the house and away from Effie with half of the couple's belongings. By the time of the racial riot and accusations facing Black community members the next day, reports had already begun to soften on the separation, instead claiming Robert Latimer was away from home, spending a few days in Oklahoma, seen down here. Florence Johnson, the neighbor who found Effie's body, was also recently separated from her husband and had been living at her parents' home a quarter of a mile away from the Latimer residence. Florence had purportedly been instructed by her father the morning of the murder to deliver a letter addressed from Robert to Effie. Upon entering the Latimer home with the letter, Florence allegedly found the bloodied Effie barely breathing. The Black community inside Catcher have forever been skeptical of the details of Florence's account of this. Ray Willis, the nephew of William Bettis, who's a journalist for the Lincoln Echo, has come up with this alternative theory that the victim's husband was having an affair with the same neighbor who found the mortally wounded woman and who is believed fabricated the erroneous story to cover up what really led to the woman's demise. And this is kind of what Black community members at that time would have probably assumed. While it's impossible to prove a definitive connection to the separation of Effie and Robert and her murder less than a week later, it does help to demonstrate how incompetently the police handled the ensuing investigation of Effie's murder. Neither Robert nor Florence were ever considered as persons of interest in the direct aftermath of the murder. I've recently found that Robert Lattimore did not even make contact with Crawford police until well after the new year, around January 3rd. By that time, Bettis, Clay, and Ruck were already in jail and set for their trial. The small town of Catcher was understandably stunned by the shocking brutality of Latimer's murder. Rumors quickly began to swirl from Catcher to Van Buren over the guilt of son Bettis. Local police in Crawford County, not wanting to leave the case unsolved for a moment longer than necessary, swiftly moved to track down Bettis. William son Bettis, age 36, was found later that night near his home in Catcher by Sheriff Albert D. Maxey of Van Buren and Deputy Sheriff W. A. Bushmeyer of Kibler. Bettis denied the claims, but was nevertheless taken into custody for the murder. Assuming a mistake had been made, Bettis calmly surrendered to the two officers and went to jail without a fight. Early the next morning, Saturday, December 29th, the investigation into Latimer's murder continued. Local officials, led by Sheriff Maxey, returned to the scene of the crime and found bloody sticks of stove wood on broken down furniture that were scattered throughout the house. Because the Latimer house was unkempt and poorly furnished to begin with, it was difficult for the officers to accurately determine what had been moved as a result of the struggle the day before. After closely casing the scene and the victim's body, the investigators found a piece of wood that appeared to be foreign to the Latimer home. Sheriff Maxey theorized the splintered wood was likely from the murderer's gun after they had clubbed Effie on the back of the head. Going off this theory, Sheriff Maxey and his officials went house to house throughout the Black community, trying to find a shotgun with this missing piece. The men entered the house of Henry Clay. Looking under the bed of his 14-year-old son, John Henry Clay, the investigators found a shotgun with a missing piece of the stock. Taking the splintered wood from the Latimer home, the men found the piece exactly fitted the broken part of the gun stock. Later court testimony indicated that Clay would then be taken into the nearby woods by a deputized citizen where he confessed to the crime, along with Spurgeon Ruck and Will Bettis. Spurgeon Ruck, at 26, this was the first time he gets mentioned as maybe an accomplice in this crime, and it's unclear in the documents whether Clay just put that name out there or if he was kind of coerced into saying that name. Realizing correctly that white community members would want extrajudicial vengeance for these crimes, Sheriff Maxey decided to transport the adults Bettis and Ruck across the Arkansas River into Sebastian County in Fort Smith rather than the closer jail located inside Crawford County. Sheriff Maxey's decision to relocate the two men proved to be prophetic, when only hours later, the white members living in and around Catcher surrounded the Crawford County jail, intending to lynch the three accused men. The local paper noted that several white women from the Catcher community, some with children at their sides and some with children in their arms, mingled with the different groups of men, urging their husband not to let these murderers escape. Initially unaware that only Clay sat in the Van Buren jail, the crowd refused to leave, even after local officials reiterated that only the young boy was inside. The local newspaper applauded the actions of these men who had gathered, and I have it highlighted here. If ever the mob spirit was justified, it would have been in this instance, and the clamor for the lives of the Black brutes was but a human cry for vengeance, a cry that has been heard from the beginning of time. Therefore, those advocating and in a hesitating way sought to lynch the Negroes are not to be censored, which is, horrifying to read. Unprepared to repel this angry mob by force, officials at the jail began bargaining with the crowd. It was decided that a committee of 3 unarmed men would be allowed to roam through the jail, to confirm that Bettis and Ruck were not inside. The two sides agreed to these terms, and the three community members were allowed access to the jail. Upon entering, the group of men indeed found only the 14-year-old child, John Henry Clay. The mob appeared to realize the importance of Clay as a material witness against the other two men, and the crowd began to only then disperse. Later that day, it somehow became publicly known that Bettis and Ruck were instead being housed in the Sebastian County Jail just across the Arkansas River. The Van Buren Press Argus, the newspaper, noted that immediately the highway was filled with automobiles, but it was evident that they were not filled with joyriders, as they were only filled with stern-faced men in them. Fully 500 men, mostly from Crawford County, assembled in front of the jail. Sebastian County Sheriff Pink Shaw, knowing that this was likely, had recently deputized 20 local men as sheriffs and armed them with riot guns in an attempt to stop the angry mob from reaching the prisoners inside. He said that they would have to walk over his dead body to get to them. Tensions ran high between this mob seeking swift vengeance and the sheriff unwilling to grant such demands. To his credit, Shaw never bowed to these extrajudicial demands. Shortly before midnight, someone in the crowd exploded a firecracker, and at which point all hell broke loose, thinking that shots had been fired. But fortunately, no one was killed, and after a few gunshots, the crowd actually dispersed. Oh, and here's just an average car in the 1920s. When I first started doing this research, I kind of assumed that poor farmers in Arkansas wouldn't have cars, so it didn't really make sense to me that they're talking about all these people getting in cars and riding up and down the highway trying to get to these jails. But then when I did some research, I found that while most of these homes didn't even have indoor plumbing, they actually did have cars because it helped on the farm. So that's, a picture of a farmer using a car for such a reason. And then during the race riot, these would have more sinister uses. At the same time the white mob was assembling around the Sebastian County Jail back in Catcher and neighboring Shibley, anonymous notices were placed advising all blacks to remove themselves from the county. The notices effectively gave black citizens of the area an ultimatum: quietly leave or be met with assured violence. During the later trial of the 11 night riders, Gus Richardson would testify that these signs said, and it's highlighted here in the court documents, "It becomes necessary for the safety of the community to ask you to leave it. You will be given a few days to straighten out your affairs. If you are out of Crawford County in 5 days, you will not be bothered. Otherwise, you will have to suffer the consequences," which we've talked about earlier. The notices were unsigned, but nevertheless made an impression on the black population living in Catcher. That last line, which is the title of this presentation, "Otherwise you will have to suffer the consequences," is disturbing to the modern reader, but readers of this sign, both black and white, would have understood what this threat meant implicitly. The fear of violence at the hands of unknown assailants was too much for many of these black families, who immediately heeded such warnings and left the county's lines permanently. Before the murder of Effie Latimer, around 50 families called Catcher home. The Fort Smith Times record reported that only 3 families stayed through the night Sunday. The overwhelming majority of the community fled that day with only what they could carry. By Monday morning, it was clear that no black families in Catcher would even attempt to stay. These citizens even left their mortgage property in the hands of their creditors, taking with them only what they could easily move. So this image is a tombstone in the St. Paul Cemetery. Sorry, let me go back a little bit. So while the unsigned notices avowed that blacks would not be bothered if they left within 5 days, this was revealed to be untrue. Late that Saturday afternoon, white citizens of Catcher began riding in cars and on horseback up and down the main roads of the town, with guns in hand, yelling at black residents to leave the county. Black houses were lit on fire, and the tombstones in the local black cemetery were smashed, with the remains of bodies dug up and burned. The process of burning homes, smashing tombstones, and digging up buried bodies is emblematic of the larger racial cleansing that was so swiftly occurring in this town. Not only did white community members want all black bodies removed from the county, they also wanted to eradicate their history from the area as well. So this is an image of a tombstone that in St. Paul Cemetery, and there's a couple like this, the Catcher Black Cemetery, that's still there today, that shows signs of being smashed during this white backlash. The Equal Justice Initiative has created the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And at this museum and their memorials, they have attempted to collect the names and stories of every Black American who was lynched after the end of slavery. One of the most interesting projects they're currently working on, them, is the Community Remembrance Project, which looks to go into communities that have experienced racial terror and provide a monument and history of that incident. So I first reached out to EJI about this race riot. They had never heard of it. So I sent them some sources, and since then they've become very interested in placing a plaque in St. Paul Cemetery to memorialize and help the community come to terms with this shocking incident that occurred in the town nearly 100 years ago. So I'm hoping that Crawford County and Van Buren officials will work with the EJI to help this project occur. In an attempt to quell the intense racial violence occurring in the town, Sheriff Maxey decided that arrangements would be immediately made to transport Bettis, Clay, and Ruck further away from the area. At 6:30 that night, the three men were placed in the back seat of the fastest automobile the sheriff could attain, driving a brand new Packard motor car, pictured here, or a replication of it, that he had gotten from the rich owner of the town bank. Sheriff Maxey sped for the Rock Island train in Fort Smith, which he was hoping could transport the accused to the state penitentiary in Pulaski County for safekeeping. Somehow, townsmen became aware of this, and they piled into their cars, pictured here like the Model Ts. Around 40 men and 10 cars and trucks sped down the road from Van Buren to Fort Smith. The men, as the local newspaper detailed, were endeavoring to overtake the automobile in which the Negroes were being taken to the railroad station. A lynching of these men would probably have occurred if any of these cars had managed to stop Sheriff Maxey. Fortunately, the sheriff's car proved faster, and the three men were safely transported to the rail line and ultimately to Pulaski County. Once in Little Rock, Sheriff Maxey decided that Clay and Ruck would be taken to the state penitentiary, while Bettis would be housed at the Pulaski County Jail. Sheriff Maxey's decision to relocate the three prisoners did little to stop the intensifying violence in the town the next day. Just after the sheriff returned to the town early the next morning, Sunday, December 30th, he received an urgent call for all deputies to report as black men were arming and fortifying at the black community's log cabin schoolhouse. It was clear that not all in the black community of Catcher had been intimidated by the actions of the white community. Gus Richardson, a veteran in World War I and leader in the black community at Catcher, had organized and armed 11 men to protect the group's homes. The 11 men, Gus Richardson, Ernest Richardson, Tandy Ferguson, Charlie Shelton, George Ricks, Dimp Richardson, Gid Richardson, Roosevelt Richardson, Liddell Richardson, Alfred Richardson, and Charles Posey, were unafraid of the threats posed by the white community. The men began stopping any car that passed by, searching it for guns or weapons that might be used against the black community. Fortunately, no one they stopped had such weapons, or likely even more violence would have occurred. Unsurprisingly, this militarization of black men garnered police attention. Within the hour, Sheriff Maxey and several other deputies and citizens arrived at the schoolhouse and found that the 11 men had retreated into the building, refusing to surrender any weapons. Governor Thomas McRae, pictured here, was at his vacation home in Prescott, Arkansas, celebrating the holidays with his family when he received an urgent telegram informing him of a potential bloody insurrection occurring inside Crawford County. McRae immediately sent a telegram to General James McAllister inside the Fort Smith National Guard post. In the order, McRae commanded McAllister to find a way to quell the insurrection without using the full force of the National Guard. McAllister decided to use an unofficial group's guardsmen and equipment to help the local sheriff. General McAllister contacted Captain Otto Kyer of Ozark in neighboring Franklin County and ordered him to proceed to Catcher with a small detachment of troops. The men arrived in Van Buren at 5 o'clock and brought with them a large state-of-the-art machine gun and aimed it directly at the schoolhouse doors. The two sides shouted terms at one another with the guarantee that no shots would be fired once the men walked out. After several tense minutes, the 11 men threw down their guns and finally surrendered. White community members in Catcher immediately understood this as an act of defiance, taking up arms, and even more insultingly, stopping white citizens as they drove by at gunpoint was the ultimate sign that these black men were not going to bend to the will of white demands. White anger boiled over at this insolence, and deputized citizens began roaming the town for any black man or woman still in the area. 52-year-old Charles Ruck, the father of Spurgeon Ruck, who had just been accused of murder, was seen walking down the main street of Catcher. Ruck, similar to Gus Richardson and his men, was unwilling to leave the community while his son sat in jail. Frederick Creekmore, a white citizen of Catcher, had just been deputized with the title Special Officer only hours earlier. He saw Ruck walking down Main Street and shouted at him to quickly put his hands up. After a brief moment passed of Ruck refusing to do so, a bullet was sent into the lower right part of his jaw. Dr. W.C. Bennett, a local physician, helped stop the bleeding, but Ruck managed to live for only several hours before dying in an immense amount of pain later that night. Unsurprisingly, the Arkansas Gazette ran the all-too-familiar headline, "Negro is killed resisting arrest," the next morning. The killing of Charles Ruck is difficult for me to categorize, As there was no mob, it was not a public spectacle, and because Creekmore was technically in a position of authority, this is not considered a lynching by those at the EJI who best understand and define the term. At the very least, though, this was a racially motivated murder. Creekmore shot Ruck in broad daylight in order to uphold white authority. Ruck was killed because he did not immediately do what a white citizen informed him to do. While the paper would argue that Ruck was resisting arrest, he would have likely known Creekmore and realized he was not a sheriff. With the confusion occurring in the town, it could be hard to tell whether such a request came from a citizen or someone in authority. During this race riot, vigilantism and law enforcement bled together in such close ways that it would have been difficult or nearly impossible to quickly tell the difference between the two, because in all actuality there was no difference. The murderer Frederick Creekmore never received any investigation or prison term. He and his wife were even star witnesses in the later trials against Bedison Ruck. So Dr. Guy Lancaster has before stated that lynching did not result from a breakdown of law and order or a challenge to law and order. It was the law and order. Whether considered a lynching or not, this murder has to be understood in much the same way. There was a clear pattern of the state and county government working for white citizens to maintain their authority through any means over minority groups. The murder of Charles Ruck was a message that those who did not bend to white authority would be met with violence. I've messaged back and forth with the EJI again on this issue, and they are pretty stark that it's not a lynching. But I finally received word last week that they are opening a new exhibit called Racial Terror Killings, and they would like to review the documents and add Charles Ruck to that database. And hopefully we can get a plaque placed on Catcher Road that's something like this in Tennessee, but in Catcher and on Main Street, where he can finally have some kind of memorial to his life. I'm hoping Crawford County will again assist with that process. So the fighting ended in Catcher the morning of Monday, December 31st. On the eve of 1924, the white community in Catcher had achieved its goal of cleansing the community of African Americans. The only black citizens who remained in the town near Catcher were those in the county jails. By the beginning of the new year, the town had begun the battle to reshape the narrative of what had just occurred in the preceding 48 hours. The local paper concluded, "So intense has been the feeling between the two races that serious trouble had been pending, and had it not been for the more conservative whites and admonitions of Sheriff Maxey, a race war would have been precipitated." In this way, whites managed to seize the narrative of the race riot and declare themselves as the reason calm ultimately emerged. While countless newspapers ran the story of the black community fleeing from Catcher, it was always with this underlying assumption that this was best for both sides. In actuality, though, only the white community gained from such an exodus. Black land was taken and white authority was reinforced. The Van Buren Press Argus newspaper concluded that the actions of the lawless black community had forced the white community to act. Remarkably, one such article argued that the legal structure in the state had protected black lawlessness in such a way that a race riot was inevitable. Quote, "It has been almost impossible to convict a Negro from that community, and this has been a smoldering fire that finally resulted in the driving of the Negroes out of the community. There were some law-abiding, hard-working Negroes living in the community, and they have been made to suffer for the misdeeds of the law-breaking class of their race." So, at the same time whites were able to force 50 black families out of the area through intimidation and extrajudicial violence, the narrative quickly became that the constant government protection of unlawful blacks had forced reasonable white hands to act. The notion that blacks were legally shielded by their government obviously does not hold up well under closer inspection. Michael Pfeiffer, in The Roots of Rough Justice, describes how lawmakers throughout this period were able to reshape the death penalty in the early 20th century to make capital punishment more efficient and more racialized. This is easily illustrated by the trials of William Bettis and Spurgeon Ruck. In Arkansas law at the time, there was to be a minimum of 15 days between the commitment of a crime and the trial to sentence the accused. Judge James Cochran of the 15th Judicial Circuit initially selected January 17th as the date to hold an arraignment against the three men. That Sunday night, though, December 30th, he was approached by a crowd, really a mob, assembled in front of his house and pressured him to move the trial up. Judge Cochran conceded to this pressure of the white community and moved the arraignment up to January 3rd, less than a week after the murder of Effie Latimer. Cochran would cite Act 258 of 1909, in which speedy trials could be given in cases where mob violence was feared. As Dr. Lancaster has noted, Arkansas jurists well understood that Act 258 was not intended to protect the rights of the accused, but rather to facilitate an execution in order to stave off mob desire for immediate revenge. While Act 258 was better known as the Tony Anti-Lynching Bill, It was only successful in staving off lynchings because it swiftly sentenced black men to death days after a crime. Such a quick turnaround would stop mob violence from occurring, while also preventing the accused from forming a proper legal defense. Act 258 helps demonstrate how the American legal system was working for white community members against minority groups under the veneer of fairness and equality. The day of the trial, the large machine gun used to force the 11 night riders to surrender had been parked on the courthouse lawn. The object of intimidation set the tone for the day's proceedings. Prosecuting attorney Dave Parton called on 9 witnesses, none of which were more important than the 14-year-old John Henry Clay. Before an estimated crowd of 800 inside the building and 300 more shouting on the courthouse lawn, the 14-year-old provided a gruesome eyewitness account of the assault, rape, and murder of Effie Latimer on the morning of December 28, 1923. The remaining 8 witnesses for the state consisted mainly of those who entered the Latimer residence directly after the crime and those who had heard the confessions of Bettison Ruck the days later. Mary Creekmore, the wife of the man who killed Charles Ruck days prior, submitted into evidence the alleged bloody dime, pictured here, found on the Latimer kitchen floor, to noticeable gasps from the jury, which appeared to corroborate Clay's story. The blood-soaked dress of Effie Latimer, with large bullet holes in the back, was paraded before the jury as a final exclamation point by the prosecution. Defense attorney W.H. Neal would cross-examine Clay, but was unable to get him to admit that he had been coerced into a confession. Several alibis, white and black, were provided for Bettison Ruck on the morning of December 28th, but it was clear that none swayed the jury. The unconvinced jury deliberated only 10 minutes for Ruck and 9 minutes for Bettis before returning verdicts of guilty for both, to shouts of approval from the packed courthouse crowd. Judge Cochran ordered the men to death by the electric chair before noon on February 15th. So that's kind of the white perspective of what happened at the trial. There's also this black perspective, which we get in the Chicago Defender, and this is by Nathan Hawkins right after the trial. And he says, a mob of Arkansas ruffians bent on lynching practically dictated the death penalty of the 2 men. The jury deliberated only 10 minutes, just enough time to sign their names to the guilty document and return to the courtroom amid wild cheers. Judge Cochran did not pronounce, but it is known that the electric chair is the only logical thing to expect in this section when the characteristic Southern quick trial is held. This is the justice Arkansas always resorts to when public sentiment clamors for blood. The Chicago Defender was correct, as William Bettis and Spurgeon Ruck were electrocuted on June 27, 1924. Both maintained their innocence until the very end. John Henry Clay, the 14-year-old boy, was still up for possible execution due to the severity of the crime, but because of his confession against the other men and his age, the prosecution decided to act leniently. On March 11, 1924, an all-white jury sentenced Clay to life in prison without parole. Clay was sentenced to the Commons Unit at the Arkansas State Penitentiary, where it was assumed he would reside for the rest of his life. Sadly, Clay would not live much longer. Clay escaped on August 6, 1928, at the age of 17, and was on the run for several days before being caught. After being returned to the prison, Clay was given 5 lashes and his workload increased. And these are the documents sent to me by the Department of Corrections with his fingerprints and his record of escape. Here's some more of them. Clay would later be found on August 28, 1928, dead in the field, allegedly from being overworked. Prison officials claimed his body had not been found for 2 weeks, and thus was too damaged by the elements to be forensically studied. This seems unlikely, however, since Clay had recently escaped and was no doubt being kept under close watch. If he had been missing for 2 weeks, they would have surely assumed he was wanting to escape again. Unfortunately, it's impossible to know exactly what happened to Clay. There seems to be 3 possible things that happened. 1, he was just overworked in the field and died due to physical exhaustion. 2, he was purposefully killed as a revenge for his escape attempt and left to rot in the field. Or 3, he committed suicide as a final act of protest. Either way, the outcome of John Henry Clay, like William Bettis and Spurgeon Ruck before him, reinforced how the state government in Arkansas had succeeded in taking away the black rights of citizens in the state. The last crucial case we need to consider in a study of Catcher is the trial of the 11 night riders who holed up in the cabin with guns. The arraignment for the 11 men began on March 19, 1924, and the prosecution claimed the defendants had been banded together to intimidate and alarm white persons. The attorney for the men, C.M. Wofford, argued that the men would be unable to gain a fair trial inside Crawford County. Because the hearing was he was able to get a change of venue into Paris, Arkansas. Because the hearing was moved to a slightly fairer location and the trial date gave the men time to actually prepare, the outcome was far better. With the help of the NAACP and famed black lawyer Scipio Jones, the 11 men were able to mount a successful defense and were acquitted of all night riding charges. This legal win would prove largely inconsequential, though, as the men and their families were still forced to leave the region permanently. So even when black men had successfully lobbied for their rights inside the court system, which again was highly irregular, a combination of intimidation and physical violence had nevertheless secured the same outcome. None would ever return to their homes in Crawford or in Catcher. By the end of the trial, no black citizen remained in Crawford County. As we discussed earlier, it was pretty unusual for a town so dependent on black labor to run its entire minority workforce out of town. So at first, this outcome really stumped me. Only around 20% of black citizens in Catcher owned their own land. So it seemed unlikely at first to me that this was all about taking black land. That was until I began to search the oil and gas records from the period. For those of you who know your environmental history of Arkansas, you'll know that Arkansas, or that El Dorado in southwest Arkansas, struck oil in January 1921. A huge rush of labor occurred in the town and made the land extremely lucrative. A similar rush, though, that not as many people talk about, occurred in 1922 and 1923 in the Arkoma Basin, pictured here. So here's a map on the Arkansas Oil and Gas Record website of every known oil and gas reserve well in the state. Here's another from the 1940s that helps to show how lucrative this land was. So you'll see here is Catcher, here is Shibley, and there's some of the most lucrative parts in the Arkoma Basin. Here's one more that's even further back in the 1940s. Again, this is Shibley, and right in here is about where Catcher is. And you can see that these are very lucrative gas wells. So what does this all mean? Well, here's the amount of money raised from gas fields in Crawford County in the 1920s. I was actually having trouble finding this as the Arkansas Oil and Gas Commission doesn't have digitized records going back past around the 1960s on their website. But fortunately, Jeffrey Stark Down in Special Collections advised me to search the Crawford County records down in their archives, and I found a breakdown of the gas produced inside the county's lines and its values. While kind of this is all speculation at this point, I think in 1921 and 1922 that it became obvious to white community members that there were valuable natural resources located under the black-held land in Catcher and Shibley. The murder of Effie Latimer provided an excellent justification for pushing black citizens off the land and into the hands of white community members. I think studying the discovery of gas in this area provides the key way in which Catcher deviated from the rest of the Arkansas communities, which never went sundown. Because they relied on black labor, while Catcher also relied on black labor, the thirst for what was being newly discovered under the land provided the rationale for the cleansing of the community. The Elaine massacre has, for good reason, dominated much of the scholarship of race in Arkansas during this period. Guy Lancaster urged that historians begin to see Elaine not as an anomaly, but as one piece of a larger history of race in Arkansas. The same must be said of the Catcher Race Riot of 1923. While a large combination of disturbing things came together in this one instance, it was by no means out of the ordinary. Arkansas communities from 1890 to 1940, especially in the Ozarks and River Valley, made a concerted effort to reinforce white authority while also cleansing the community of black citizens. The playbook was fairly uniform in these cases. The use of extrajudicial justice and lynchings that would never be prosecuted has been the easiest to track and study for historians. This violence laid the groundwork for the second and less studied measure taken by local communities: intimidation and the threat of violence. As early as the Reconstruction period, it was already well established that violence could and would be used against black citizens without consequence. Citizens black and white in these small towns understood this. For this reason, it was easy and routine for a simple notice to be placed and a community to be cleansed without any major disturbance occurring. Only because 11 men bravely decided to push back against this authority did violence again become used to reinforce power. All of this would not have been possible, though, without the underlying assistance of the county, state, and federal government. Violence against blacks became routine after Reconstruction because laws permitting it were no longer enforced. New laws like Act 258 made the legal cleansing of communities even easier. By studying the counties that experienced stark drops in black population numbers, similar to what occurred in Crawford County, historians need to begin demonstrating how and why this process took place. While larger events like Elaine, Tulsa, and Catcher are easier to document, scholars need to begin searching for all these instances. As a society, I don't think we can properly move beyond our troubling racial history until we understand how and why we got here. So just to conclude, here's a picture of Effie Latimer's great-grandniece, Linda Griffith, who provided me with a lot of the documents we saw today, who lives currently in Montana, and her visiting with Dorothy Smith of Fort Smith, a descendant of William's son Bettis. The two first met at a 2013 convention that brought descendants of Catcher together. The two became friends after learning about their shocking shared history. I think it's a positive image to end on and help show the power of confronting history head on, even if the findings are disturbing. Thanks for listening.
All right. Thanks again, Michael, for a really interesting presentation. Um, at this point, I would like to open it up to questions. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, please go ahead and put it in the chat, and then I will pose those questions. And while we're waiting for people to type some questions, oh, we have a lot of accolades, great presentation, that kind of thing in the chat. But while we're waiting for people to type up their questions, Michael, I was wondering, you touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where all you found your sources. So it seems like you had a really broad range, including sort of institutional sources and connecting with individual descendants. So if you could kind of talk us through how that process unfolded, I think that would be interesting and help kind of contextualize for people who might be trying to do research in similar areas.
Yeah, so I started out just trying to find the background info by looking through the state archives, just through their newspaper collections. And they have pretty much all these newspapers on microfilm there. And the first thing I did was just go through the Van Buren Press Argus for these days from 1923 December until the summer of 1924. And it was pretty shocking just reading, day by day the accounts of what's occurring. And then I kind of started to broaden out. I looked at the Fort Smith Times Record, the Southwest American, and then I looked at the Fayetteville Daily Democrat, and then the Arkansas Gazette and the Arkansas Democrat. And after doing all that, I kind of had this white perspective of what had just occurred. And it was pretty obvious that there wasn't any black perspective in these documents. So to find that, I had to go to the Chicago Defender and the Evening Star, which are two black newspapers that I found on newspaper.com. And then I kind of started to have these conflicting images or conflicting stories of what had just occurred. And then I went to the court documents in Crawford County, Sebastian County, and Logan County, where the three trials are being held. And then you kind of have at least a slight black perspective of what's occurring. At least you have Ruck, Bettis, and Clay on the stand talking, and that's something. Because without that, you don't have women's voice in this, and you don't have a black voice in this. So one of the things I really want to do going forward with this project is try and find some kind of voice from women. I talk all about Effie Latimer, but you never hear from her, and I think that's a real problem. And you don't hear it all from minority women, and again, that's a problem.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat about other, in quotes, riots in other small towns around this time in the Arkansas Ozarks. This person is familiar with a few in Missouri from about 10 to 15 years before, but is wondering if you're aware of other riots in other small towns in this region.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Kimberly Harper book, and that's basically all she talks about. And that book only goes up to 1907, I think. But she calls it the book on the Ozarks, but it's mainly on Missouri. And I think she gets down into the Bonanza Race riots, which is in 1907 in Fort Smith. And all of that, I think, kind of lays the groundwork. And you need to understand how all of that's occurring before you get to Catcher. And I was trying to make that kind of clear in the presentation, and I make it even more clear, I think, in my paper that you can't understand how all of this occurs by just looking at one incident at a time. You need to look at every single thing that's occurring and why it's happening in certain places and not in others. So the Ozarks has a completely different racial history and race riot history than Southeast Arkansas. But nevertheless, you need to look at all of it to understand the history of race in the state.
Another question is if you found any indication of how much the white population benefited financially from the theft of the land, is how they have put it. And is there any attempt to restore land to the original Black owners?
Yeah, this is kind of the research I'm doing day by day today. is trying to figure out, because there were some trials, it sounds like, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to try and get this land back. And I'm trying to find the court documents for that because all I know right now is the newspaper accounts because the newspapers actually talk about it. So what I would do is do a keyword search and try and figure out when these trials are taking place. But I still haven't been able to find the actual court documents of it occurring, just that there was some mention in the papers of Black community members in Fort Smith and Sequoyah County trying to get some of this land back. So that's kind of just ongoing research. I hope to answer soon.
Okay, so we had another comment in the chat, comment/question. So this person grew up in Greenwood, not far from Van Buren. They're a historian of the South, but had never heard of this story that you presented on today. They were curious what response your research and the descendants' efforts are receiving locally. So those descendants that you've worked with on this project, kind of how their work and your work with them is being received in those local communities.
Yeah, so I mentioned in the presentation, so the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, is kind of working concurrently on two different things right now, which is that plaque for Charles Ruck and then a memorial in St. Paul Cemetery. And on both accounts, it sounds like Crawford County is going to work with them. From what I've heard, I'm basically just emailing to EJI, but from what they've said, it sounds like Crawford County is open to like these suggestions and confronting this past, which I hope is true. But talking about the descendants directly, they've one of the things I'm trying to do here over the summer is start to interview these people directly. Moira Bryant, she used to be a student at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith. She wrote a nice paper on this where she kind of interviews people directly. And we're doing a radio show together, her and I, along with MC Richardson up in Kansas City the first week of April sometime. And we're going to sit down and hopefully we can get some of the descendants to join us and kind of have this open dialogue of what should occur in the town now because of all this.
Very cool. I will ask you later if you want to send me that link when you have that show going so that I can share it. Oh yeah, we just had a question. Will you share that radio show with us when it airs?
Yeah, of course. It's a KKFI,
yeah, so
MC Richardson, Kansas City. He does a daily show, and he's actually one of the descendants of the Richardson clan of the 11 Night Riders. So he's really interested in this.
Very cool. Okay. We had another question that I think you just answered in your previous answer, which was, does it look like there will be cooperation from the community to get the plaque installed where this happened so that there's more awareness of this history? And you said the county seemed open?
Either way, the EJI said they're going to put it in their museum in Montgomery, Alabama. So either way, there will at least be some mention of Crawford County and Charles Ruck in Montgomery. But yeah, hopefully we can get it on the ground in Catcher.
Awesome. All right. If you have any final questions, go ahead and stick them in the chat now. Otherwise, I think we'll be wrapping up. I'm going to drop in the chat the link if you are a grad student and you would like to pursue presenting as part of this series. That link is in the chat. And you can also email me. I'll put my email in here as well. I will see if I can get a link from Michael when that radio show goes live in April, and I can send it out to all of you in another mass email. We also just got a question about if this will be available later for viewing, and yes, it will. So we're still recording right now. So once the event has ended, I will upload this full presentation and the Q&A portion to YouTube, and then everyone who's registered through Eventbrite will automatically get that link sent to them in the whatever email you registered with, whichever email you've been receiving other stuff from Eventbrite. So that will go out to everyone who's registered, and then, feel free to share it widely with those that might be interested. And if you want to share it with someone, you can always email me as well and get the link that way. But all of you that have registered, will get the link automatically, probably towards the end of today, in your email inbox. And then we have a few other messages of just support and thanks for Michael. An extremely interesting presentation and very important topic to talk about. So thank you again for being willing to share your research. And if you want to have any kind of final words, I will let you take the floor and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, just thanks so much for everybody for showing up and listening to the presentation. Like I said, try and tune in, and I think it's April 6th, but I'm not positive the day. But that radio station interview will be pretty interesting. It should be like 2 hours with all these descendants talking about what happened. And I think it's going to be very interesting.
All right. Thanks again, everybody.